Hello YouTube, this is Robert Ness816 and today I'm going to be reviewing the Sega Genesis controller. So here I have three Sega Genesis controllers. There are three different versions of the 3-button controller and one version of the 6-button controller. I do not have the final version of the 3-button controller because I actually sold that one off. But I'll get into the review. So I'm going to start off with the first 3-button controller, so I'll push the 6-button aside. And basically this is the controller that came with your HD Model 1 Sega Genesis. So that's the Sega Genesis with the Yamaha FM synthesizer in it. This is your, at least this is my childhood Genesis controller. Everyone that I was friends with back in the day had a Model 1 Genesis, and they all had these controllers. So this is like what I remember as a kid, pretty much. So as far as how it feels in the hand, this controller does feel pretty darn good in the hand. Sega did a great job of designing this controller. The only downside, of course, is that it has 3 buttons instead of 6. The D-pad on this controller is great. Very responsive. The A, B, and C buttons work great. Start button does what it's supposed to do, you know. The downside to this controller and pretty much all the other Genesis controllers is that these buttons do degrade over time, and it is unfortunately more common to find a degraded Genesis controller these days than it is to find a good one. That's just how it is. These things are like 20 years old now. On the other hand, you can find third-party Genesis controllers that are also 3-button like this, and you can actually take the button contacts out of those controllers, put them into these controllers, since most of them are very loose copies of the original Genesis controllers. So if you find an older third-party controller that's not working or it's in really crappy shape, take it apart and take all the rubber contacts out and throw it in one of these. That's what I did with this one here, actually, and it feels like it's brand new now. So that's the original 3-button controller and now the second 3-button controller. So slight differences here in cosmetic appearances. Everything's white instead of red. A, B, and C is on the top now instead of being in the buttons. The trigger has been moved to the bottom. The D-pad, that's the biggest difference here, and that's why I really like this particular controller better than the first-gen Genesis controller. Not that this one's bad, but I like this one a little bit better. The ball on the D-pad is actually built into the rubber button contact that makes contact with the circuit board. So it's actually a metal ball instead of a plastic one like on this controller. So the throw on it is slightly shorter, and I'll show you this one. This is the original. So you can see this one's a slightly longer throw and this one's shorter. Buttons feel the same, but the D-pad on this one is great. So this controller would have come with your Model 2 Genesis or your later non-HD graphics Model 1 Genesis. This one only came with the original Genesis and the later HD Model 1 Genesis. So there's also a third version of this controller out, which I sold. I sold it because it has literally the worst D-pad I've ever used in my entire life. Not as bad as the third-party Genesis controllers, but it is pretty bad. Basically, Sega took this design, which was fine in and of itself, and then they ruined it by putting in a terrible D-pad. So this one has a nice short throw, feels great. Then they made a mistake of making this D-pad, but they made it with a much longer throw. It feels mushy, it feels crappy, I hate it. I don't know why they did it. This one feels okay, but I don't know. Sega did strange things back then, and I don't like what they did. So if you're looking for a Genesis controller, look for these two designs. These are both great and you can't go wrong with them. Just make sure the buttons on them are still good. They should have a mushy clickiness to them. But like I said, unfortunately with these controllers you often find them more worn out than in good condition. Also check the backs of them, make sure that they're in good shape. And check these screws. A lot of the times with these Genesis controllers, I will find that the screws are missing, and that's because the screw posts inside have broken or the screws have popped out from either flexing the controller or throwing it to something, I don't know. Also, there's a version of these controllers that has a really short cord to it. I don't know why, but Those I would avoid as well, unless you're looking to swap out the board, which you could, and then you would have a a good Genesis controller at that point. So the 6-button controller. This one is great. It's a little bit smaller than these. It fits in a hand a little bit better, and more importantly, it has 3 extra buttons. So if you're big into Street Fighter or Streets of Rage, Comic Zone, any other newer Sega Genesis game will make use of the 6-button controller. The D-pad, not as good as the 3-button controller in my opinion, but it still works pretty darn good. And the biggest thing is the design. I really like how this controller fits in the hand, and it just feels great. The cord length is just as long as the other controllers, and it pretty much just gets the job done. It's a great controller. So if you have a Sega Genesis, one of these is definitely a must-have. So that's pretty much my review on the Sega Genesis controllers. Thanks for watching, guys.